Story 1. The Smiling Man. Rachel had always felt comfortable walking home alone at night. She lived in a bustling city where the streets were rarely empty, and she had never encountered anything to make her fearful. But tonight was different. The streets were quieter than usual, the air strangely still. The usual hum of traffic was gone, leaving only the distant sound of a dog barking and the occasional rustling of leaves in the cold night breeze. She hugged her jacket closer, shivering slightly, not just from the chill, but from the eerie feeling creeping up her spine. Then she saw him. He stood beneath a flickering streetlight, just past the edge of the sidewalk. He was tall, unnaturally thin, and dressed in a suit that looked decades out of style. Worn and faded, like it had been left in a closet for years. But it wasn't his clothes that unsettled her, it was his face. His mouth was stretched into an unnaturally wide grin, frozen in place, as if his skin had been pulled too tight. His eyes, deep set and gleaming under the dim light, were locked onto her, unblinking. Rachel's stomach twisted. There was something profoundly wrong about him. She averted her gaze and walked faster, her footsteps echoing against the pavement. Maybe he was just some street performer or a weirdo looking for attention. The city had plenty of those. But then, he moved, not walked. Moved. His body didn't sway, his arms didn't pump like a normal person's would when they walked. He glided forward, his legs shifting just enough to simulate a normal stride, but it was wrong. Too smooth, too fast. Rachel's pulse spiked. She quickened her pace. So did he. She turned a corner. So did he. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts now. She wasn't just imagining things, he was following her. Rachel broke into a sprint, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. She could feel the presence behind her, that silent, gliding movement, keeping up effortlessly. Her apartment was just 2 blocks away. She could make it. She didn't dare look back. She reached the front door of her building and practically threw herself against it, fumbling with her keys. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely fit the key into the lock. The moment the door clicked open, she shoved herself inside and slammed it shut. Panting, she pressed her forehead against the cool wood. Safe. Or so she thought. She hesitated, then slowly turned to look through the peephole. Nothing. The street was empty. The smiling man was gone. Rachel exhaled shakily. Maybe she'd overreacted. Maybe she'd imagined the way he moved, the unnatural glide. Maybe exhaustion was getting to her. She double-locked the door, took a deep breath, and made her way to her bedroom, still rattled but trying to convince herself it was just a strange encounter and nothing more. That night, sleep came slowly. Her mind replayed the sight of his grin over and over again. That impossibly wide, frozen grin. Hours later, sometime in the middle of the night, she woke with a start, a noise, something soft, something inside her apartment. Rachel sat up, her heart pounding. Silence. She held her breath, straining her ears. Then, a whisper, low, deliberate. Just 3 words. "I saw you smile." Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she turned her head toward her bedroom door, and there, standing in the darkness of her doorway, was the smiling man, still grinning. Story 2. The Man in the Vents. Jake had lived in his apartment for 6 months before he started noticing the noises. At first, they were subtle. Soft tapping sounds in the walls, faint creaks in the ceiling. Nothing unusual for an old building. He figured it was just the pipes settling or maybe a few rats scurrying through the vents, but then the noises changed. Late at night, when the world outside was silent, he would hear it. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Deliberate. At first, he thought it was his imagination. Lying in bed, he held his breath, listening carefully. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. It was faint, but distinct. And worse, it was close. Jake sat up, heart hammering against his ribs. The sound wasn't coming from his room. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the vent. He stared at the metal grate near the floor, his skin prickling with unease. The rhythmic breathing continued, slow and steady, as if someone was pressed up against the vent. Watching him, he swallowed hard and forced himself to laugh. "It's just my mind playing tricks on me," he muttered. Maybe he was just overtired. But the next night, it happened again, and then again. For weeks, he tried to ignore it. He'd leave the TV on to drown out the noise. He convinced himself it was just an odd echo from another apartment. Then, one night, something happened that he couldn't ignore. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he heard a sound he knew wasn't the pipes or the building settling. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the vent. Jake sat up, his entire body tense. He barely dared to breathe. Another whisper, so close. Then, a soft, chilling chuckle. His blood turned to ice. He scrambled out of bed, grabbing the heaviest thing he could find, a lamp, and marched toward the vent. His pulse roared in his ears as he knelt down, his fingers shaking as he reached for the metal grate. Slowly, carefully, he unscrewed it. Taking a deep breath, he lifted a flashlight and shined it inside. For a moment, he saw nothing, just dust and darkness. Then, something moved. A pair of bloodshot eyes stared back at him. Jake screamed and staggered backward, knocking over his nightstand. The eyes didn't blink, they just watched him. Shaking, Jake grabbed his phone and called the police, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. When the officers arrived, they searched the vents. What they found made Jake's stomach churn. A nest, a hidden passageway through the walls, leading to multiple apartments, old, rotting food, piles of stolen clothes, and photographs, dozens of them, all of Jake, some taken from inside his room, some from the foot of his bed, and some taken mere inches from his face. The man had been living in the vents, sneaking into Jake's apartment while he slept. The police never found him, but that night, after the officers left, Jake lay awake, staring at the vent, and in the suffocating silence, he swore he could still hear it. The breathing. Story 3. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. Tom had been driving for hours. The highway stretched endlessly into the darkness, the white lines on the pavement blurring together in the dim glow of his headlights. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion creeping into his bones. The road was empty, no other cars, no streetlights, just the vast, empty countryside stretching into the void. Then, up ahead, he saw her. A young woman stood on the side of the road, shivering in the cold. She wore a thin, white dress that clung to her frame, damp and slightly torn. Her long hair hung in tangled strands over her shoulders. Tom hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something he usually did, but something about her seemed wrong. Still, he slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, her pale lips barely moving. "Need a ride?" She hesitated, then gave a slow, almost reluctant nod. Tom unlocked the door, and she climbed into the back seat without a word. Immediately, he noticed how cold she was. The temperature in the car seemed to drop the second she sat down. He glanced at her through the rearview mirror. She stared out the window, her expression unreadable. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to ease the tension. She didn't answer. Tom swallowed. "Where are you headed?" This time, her lips moved. "Home." Her voice was so soft, barely above a whisper. She lifted a hand and pointed down the road. Tom nodded and started driving again, but unease gnawed at him. The longer they drove, the more the air in the car seemed to grow heavy, thick with something he couldn't name. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably. He risked another glance in the mirror. She was staring at him now, his stomach clenched. There was something unsettling about her gaze, something hollow, something wrong. He forced himself to focus on the road. After several minutes, she finally spoke again. "Turn here." Tom hesitated but obeyed, taking a narrow side road leading into a cluster of trees. A house loomed at the end of the path, a small, weathered structure barely visible in the dim light. "This is it?" Tom asked, stopping the car. She nodded. Relieved, he turned to tell her she'd arrived. The back seat was empty, his breath caught in his throat. The car door hadn't opened. He hadn't heard anything. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. What the hell was going on? After a moment, he forced himself to move. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, his pulse hammering in his ears. He hesitated at the door before knocking. A long silence. Then, the door creaked open. An elderly woman peered out, her face lined with age and sadness. "Can I help you?" she asked. Tom cleared his throat, feeling ridiculous. Yeah. I just gave a ride to a young woman. She said this was her house." The woman's face drained of color. Tom's stomach twisted. "Is something wrong?" he asked. The woman swallowed hard. "My daughter," she whispered. "She died 10 years ago." Tom felt the air leave his lungs. That's not possible. She was just in my car." The woman shook her head slowly. "You're not the first." Tom's heart dropped. The woman turned and pointed to a framed photograph hanging on the wall. Tom's breath hitched. It was her, the girl in his back seat. A sudden gust of wind blew past him, cold as the grave, and in the distance, from the trees where the road had led him, he swore he heard soft laughter. Story 4. The Woman in the Hotel Room. The businessman had been on the road for 12 hours straight. His body ached, his eyes burned from staring at the highway, and all he wanted was a shower and sleep. When he finally pulled into the small roadside hotel, he barely noticed the peeling paint on the walls or the flickering fluorescent light above the entrance. He just wanted a bed. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, handed him an old brass key with the number 211 engraved on it. "There's just one thing," she said, her voice strangely hesitant. "Please do not open the door to room 209 under any circumstances." He frowned. "Why?" The woman hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. For a moment, it seemed like she was debating whether or not to tell him. Finally, she just said, "It's for your own safety." Too exhausted to push for answers, he nodded and took the key. The hallway smelled like old carpet and faint traces of bleach. As he walked past room 209, something made his skin prickle. The door looked normal, chipped wood, a tarnished brass handle, nothing unusual, but the air around it felt off. Suffocating, like something unseen was pressing against his chest. Shaking off the unease, he continued to his room, threw his bags on the chair, and collapsed onto the bed. He wasn't sure what woke him later that night. At first, he thought it was a dream. Then he heard it again, knocking. Slow, deliberate. His eyes snapped open. His pulse quickened. The knocking came from down the hall. Room 209. He sat up, listening. Boom, boom, boom. It wasn't frantic, not the way someone would knock if they needed help. It was too slow, too steady. A chill ran down his spine. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Silence. The businessman exhaled, shaking his head, probably just his imagination or another guest messing around. But then he heard something else, a noise inside his room. A faint, almost imperceptible whispering. His breath hitched. His hands clenched the sheets. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway anymore. It was coming from the vent above his bed. The whispering grew clearer, a woman's voice. "Please, help me." Every muscle in his body locked up. The voice was so close, as if someone was inside the vent, just above him. Slowly, he sat up and looked at the metal grate. It was small, too small for anyone to fit inside, right? And yet, the voice continued. "Let me out. He's still here." His breath came in shallow gasps. "Who's still here?" he whispered, before he could stop himself. Silence. Then a soft giggling. He nearly fell out of bed. His hands were ice cold as he grabbed his phone, shining the flashlight toward the vent. Nothing. No movement, no shadow, no sign of anything at all. But the air felt heavier now, like something unseen was watching him. He barely slept. The next morning, dark circles under his eyes, he stormed to the front desk. He slammed his key down. "What the hell happened in room 209? The receptionist's face went pale. "I told you not to go near that room." "I didn't," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But I heard knocking, and someone was whispering in my room." "A woman?" The receptionist's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted some papers. She took a slow breath, then said, "Sir, no one has stayed in that room for years." A sick feeling settled in his stomach. "Then who was knocking?" The woman hesitated before speaking. "Years ago, a woman checked into room 209. She was traveling alone, just passing through. No one saw much of her, but the next morning, the maid found her dead, strangled. They never found out who did it." The businessman's chest tightened. "And the knocking?" The receptionist's expression darkened. "It started not long after she died. People staying near room 209 reported hearing knocking at night, sometimes whispers. Some even claimed they saw someone standing behind the peephole, watching them." His throat went dry. The peephole. The memory came rushing back, the moment when he had stepped into the hallway and peered through it. How the keyhole had been pitch black, like something was pressed against it. His stomach twisted. "What did she look like?" he asked. barely above a whisper. The receptionist sighed. The police report said that when they found her body, her eyes were completely black. A sharp chill ran through his veins. That darkness he had seen through the keyhole last night, it wasn't nothing. It was an eye watching him